Hey, welcome to another edition of the Nonprofit Leadership Studio. Another great guest tonight. We have Andy Canales in the studio. Andy, a longtime colleague of mine, and is currently the Executive Director of Latinos for Education. Andy, how's it going, man?
It's going great, yeah.
Very good, yeah. So thanks for being here today.
Absolutely.
And so the first question that I often ask leaders as they sit here, Andy, is if you're writing a book on leadership, so the Andy Canales book on leadership, what are some of the chapters for you?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I took a leadership class a few years ago with these professors that have done surveys over the last 35 years. They've asked over 1 million employees, what are the qualities they look for in the leaders they follow?
Yeah.
And there's about 30 different behaviors that have kind of emerged from that research. And so before the professors gave us our results, they said there are 2 behaviors that if you as a leader don't exhibit, you're in big trouble. And so, we're all very nervous before getting our results. And they said, the 2 behaviors are, what do people say when they read, this person treats others with dignity and respect, and this person follows through on his or her commitments and promises made. So I guess one of the chapters I would write would probably center on those 2 things, like how you treat others, whether they're your boss, whether they're your employee, whether they're partners, et cetera. That's a universal value.
Dignity and respect.
Absolutely. Yeah. And the second thing is you actually do what you said you were going
follow
to do.
Through.
Yeah.
So. Isn't that, I mean, it's so interesting, right? This whole idea of follow through, such a simple concept, yet so many leaders, well, they really aren't good leaders when they're not following through.
Yeah, and it's really tough, especially if you're working in the nonprofit sector. You may not have as many staff or resources, and so you're often wearing a lot of different hats. So it's very easy for things to fall through the cracks. But I think that if you're leading a team, people want to follow leaders who are competent, that hold them to high expectations, but at the same time, treat them with respect and dignity, right? And so that follow-through piece is really important, coupled with that respect part as well.
Andy, you're a relatively new leader of an organization. Obviously, you've had leadership roles throughout your career and college. I know you were a leader in college. But this transition for you, because you're relatively new, obviously, whenever you take on a new role, stuff goes through your head. What do I need to get better at? What am I going to focus on? What sort of things like that have you thought about as you started in this role at Latinos for Education?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the first thing that an executive director, the most important thing is fundraising.
Yeah.
As right. You know very well.
Yeah.
And so when I reflect, right, that on what I could be doing better, I'm constantly thinking about how am I doing on that front in terms of generating the resources that are necessary for me to be able to support this work.
Yeah.
What's going well, what isn't going well. And a lot of times, when things aren't going well, I reflect on how am I messaging the mission of the organization? How am I building relationships and partnerships with others? How am I seizing on the opportunities and coming across? And so I think that is just one example of, as a new leader and with a priority that is really important, how I go through that reflection process. Wow. And that's probably applicable to tons of different things that are on our radars as well.
Give viewers an idea of, 30 seconds, what is Latinos for Education about?
Yeah, so it's an education nonprofit that places, connects, and develops essential Latino talent in the education sector, primarily in 2 different ways. One, on board of director roles. So only 8% of people that serve on boards of education nonprofits here in Houston are Latino.
Wow.
Even though Latino students, as you very well know, make up half of the student population and 62% at Houston ISD. So
54% in the state of Texas, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
So one of the programs that we're launching is a fellowship to take Latino leaders that are not involved in education through a 6-month program on how to become an effective board member and then serve as a pipeline of leadership into those boards of education nonprofits. And then the second program we're going to run It's called the Aspiring Latino Leaders Program, where we're going to take a cohort of 30 to 40 Latino leaders, ages 25 to 35, who are working in education currently, and taking them through a 9-month leadership and professional development program.
Wow. And will that be an intense program for those guys?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what's going to be really neat is that it'll be the only program really in Houston that is a space specifically for Latino leaders in education. And to be able to go through a professional development and leadership that could hopefully help them accelerate their careers and be able to be more effective in whatever role they're in.
Yeah. Andy, I want to take a step back and really let the audience know about your background. You and I have been in the room together. We often talk about you sort of being a first-generation college student. Tell us about your experience there, because you have a unique experience.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, both my parents...
The short version.
Okay. Both my parents immigrated from El Salvador. They fled the Civil War in the early 1980s. I grew up in inner city Los Angeles, went through some pretty challenging public schools, through the combination of a lot of hard work, a lot of support from my parents and teachers. And I feel like a few lucky breaks along the way.
Of course,
I was able to accomplish my dream of attending Pepperdine University in Malibu, California, which is
a private school, sort of selective, right?
It was a private school, and it was actually a neighborhood that I used to clean houses in with my mom during the summer as a little kid in Malibu, Beverly Hills, and Bel Air. And so going to college there was a dream come true, and that's one of the reasons I'm so passionate about education.
Yeah. And you were the student body president at Pepperdine, right?
I was, yes.
Yeah. So that right away, leadership right off the bat.
Yeah.
And then what prompted you to enter the nonprofit world? I know you did Teach for America after college, and talk a little bit about that sort of transition.
Yeah, so I didn't study education in college. I did Teach for America because I wanted to give back to my community, and especially in the field of education. But my intention was probably to go to law school. After I taught in the classroom, it really inspired me to continue to work in education, but also to try to make an impact outside of the classroom on a more systemic level. And so over the years, I've kind of have worked in a variety of different roles in that nonprofit sector that have allowed me to do that.
When you think about Latinos in this country, Andy, and as nonprofit leaders, we're talking about this stuff all the time, right? But I wonder, when we think about Latinos in the country, and our parents, many of them didn't graduate from high school even. How are Latinos doing, and how should things change for Latinos in our country, do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think the Latino population is obviously it's growing very rapidly, right? And we see that here in the state of Texas. So using Texas as an example that I think mirrors a lot of what's happening in the country. Since 2005, I'm not mistaken, there has been an increase of 800,000 Latino students in the state of Texas. Texas. That is bigger than the population of 4 different states in the District of Columbia. And so, on the other hand, only about 10% of Latino students are graduating college ready. And so, what I view that is as a call to our region, and to the state, and to the country, where we see similar statistics, that if the Latino population is successful, then all of us are going to be successful. And so we need to be devoting the resources and the attention necessary to help this growing population.
One of the things we talk about with politics is that in Texas and in California and many areas of our country, Latinos tend not to vote. How does that impact us sort of working to make sure that we're funding Latinos, we're funding education for Latinos? What does that mean?
Yeah. Well, I think, usually there's low voter turnout amongst a lot of different groups. But as you mentioned, young people is another great example. But I think what you're zeroing in on that's so important is the Latino population, because it's becoming so sizable here in Texas, and that we see is really under attack on so many different fronts.
It is.
That the call for to get involved and to vote has never been more urgent, you know, in my opinion. In terms of how it's going to be affecting us, I think something I'm really concerned about is the census. So every time there's a census, Latino students are undercounted.
Yep.
And I think given all of the rhetoric and the fear in the community right now, we're very concerned about Latinos not just not voting, but also not being counted in the census. And I think those are some really real examples, right, of things that we're concerned about right now.
Yeah. Do you see the nonprofit community really working actively on behalf of Latinos? I mean, you and I have talked about this idea that there aren't enough sort of Latino serving organizations in Texas, in Houston, in Dallas. Could there be more happening in the nonprofit community?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think, you know, the challenges are so great and there's so many statistics to cite that I think there's a need to serve all populations, right? I mean, you can find statistics that show a need, but I think what is really concerning, as we've mentioned, is that you know, the Latino population here in Houston has gone from less than 10% in 1960 to approaching, to now 43%, to approaching 50% in the next 20 years. And so in terms of nonprofit serving, like, we're going to need a lot more support and a lot more help to make sure that this population and the entire region as a consequence is successful.
Let me ask you a very political question, sort of in current politics, right? When Donald Trump...
I'll give you a very political response.
Yeah. Oh, I'll press you.
Yeah.
So when Donald Trump announced that he was running for president, his opening speech, he talked about Mexicans coming to our country are rapists, right?
Yeah.
He said a lot of other things, but that was something that sort of stuck. Subsequently, in his presidency, you know, he talked about how not as many people died in Puerto Rico as people said. And it seems like he's said, you know, building the wall, a lot of things that seem to offend sensibilities of Latinos, whether they're Caribbean Latinos or Central American or Mexican Latinos. He still got, it's what, maybe 30% of the Latino vote still went to Donald Trump. How has he changed Latino voting in the future, do you think?
Yeah. Well, I think the first thing I'll say is I'm not surprised, right? So I love history. I actually just finished a 6-part documentary on the Roosevelts on PBS. And, you know, the clips and the videos during FDR's time, when you see how the rhetoric around that time during the Great Depression, how it centered on the immigrants and how, you know, there were efforts to stop refugees from coming to this country, you often see history repeat itself. And you see these types of people emerge in every single generation that target different subgroups and use rhetoric to generate support. So one, I'm not surprised. I think two, in terms of the voting, I'm not surprised as well either. I mean, I think almost 45% of the Latino population voted for President George W. Bush. Now, he was a completely different president. He's from Texas, so he understood how to talk to the Latino community. But even Mitt Romney, I think, generated around 28% of the vote. So on the question in terms of Latinos voting for a Republican, I'm not surprised that he got 30% of the vote generally. In terms of how he's changed it for the future, you know, I think time will tell. If you would have asked me that question before the election, I would have said, oh, I mean, the Republican Party is not going to get more votes than Mitt Romney.
Yeah,
but
they did.
They did, and I was wrong. So, and that was in spite of all the rhetoric already during that time. And
there was a lot.
So we may see things actually not changing. They may always be, you know, 1/3 of the Latino population that votes, you know, for that type of rhetoric.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
Let's go back to leadership a little bit in the nonprofit world. As you begin your work for Latinos for Education, and you look at the landscape of nonprofits in the state of Texas. So where are your examples? When you look around at nonprofits that are focusing on education, where are your examples of the nonprofits that you want to emulate, maybe part of what they're doing? What are some of the good examples of nonprofits doing good work?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think there's so many. You know, I think Baker Ripley always stands out as a large community organization that helps a lot of people in need in a variety of different ways. Obviously, I'm biased because I used to work at Children at Risk, but
One of the great organizations, right? Yeah.
In terms of advocacy and policy, you know, there's not that many organizations that are doing that type of work at scale in Texas. And so I think that's a component that I really appreciate, especially as someone that's passionate about public policy. But yeah, I just think there's so many that are doing different things. I know the Latin Women's Initiative, which several of my friends are on the board of. They raise hundreds of thousands of dollars every year to support nonprofits here in the region that specifically help the Latino population and children. And so there's so many examples for me to draw on that I'm super excited, obviously, to follow in the footsteps of many other people that I've already, blazed this trail.
Yeah, very good. Okay, let's go to the Twitterverse. A lot of people tweeting in today. Jennifer Ross wants to know right off the bat, what's the most personal effect that Donald Trump's presidency has had on you? I'm almost sorry I brought up that, because I won't ask anymore. Almost sorry. You know me too well, Andy.
Yeah. Well, both my parents, as I mentioned, immigrated from El Salvador. So even though I was born and raised here in the United States, family is a part of who I am, and it's a part of my identity. And so any politician, regardless of their political stripes, that uses rhetoric to demean immigrants, to demean refugees, is something that I take personally. Because even though I wasn't an immigrant and a refugee myself, I can be sympathetic, and I can say I can be sympathetic. I can't even be empathetic because I have never been an immigrant. But I often think about my parents who came here and became my dad a mechanic and my mom a housekeeper. And they've accomplished so much. And I wonder if there was a civil war that broke out in the United States or something crazy, and someone just took me and I left and got plopped into a foreign country. I had to start from scratch. And my degrees here from Pepperdine didn't count. And I had to learn a new language and a new trade. That would be very hard. And so I'm very sympathetic towards that population. And so the effect it's had is that, it's something that I take personally. But I use that and I channel that to try to do good work for that population.
Wow. Mia J wants to know, what do you think are some of the disadvantages Latinos face that prevent them from acquiring a high school diploma or a college degree?
Well, I think about my own experience. I remember when I got to Pepperdine, tuition, room, and board back then was $38,000 a year. It is now $75,000 a year. My household income was $25,000 a year. And so when I was sitting alongside my peers and friends, they had tutors for the SAT and the ACT from a very early age. They had trips to colleges. They had parents who were college educated and could help them navigate the process. And so that is a barrier that I see a lot of first generation Latino, African American, and others face that I think sometimes holds them back. And so I'm so excited for these organizations like Emerge and Project Grad that help first generation college students navigate that.
And it's really, you and I know, poverty, sometimes it's language, but mostly poverty has held back a whole generation of, continues to hold back generations of kids in terms of going to college, right? It's the biggest indicator. Mike Martin wants to know, how do we get more people to understand that if young Latinos in Houston succeed in education, then Houston will succeed? That's a good question.
That's a great question.
That's a great question. And that's a question that is, when you ask the first question about what do you reflect on,
messaging, that is something I'm continuously working on. How do I communicate this message to a wide range of audiences? And I think that, the best way to communicate it is that when you have a population of this size, all of the research shows that higher education correlates with lower crime levels. It correlates with lesser dependence on government.
Yeah.
It correlates with a lot of different statistics that make the community and the society as a whole better, right? And so if people are depending less on government services, there is less crime that is being committed because people are better educated. You and I and others who are not Latino are going to be better off as a result.
Yeah, very good. Kerwin Ross wants to know, right now, with the climate of our country, how hard is it for nonprofits like yours to do fundraising?
So I think that I actually don't think the climate
Hurts fundraising.
Hurts fundraising, yeah.
I think in some ways it might help.
Perhaps.
Yeah.
But I think that the people that we're approaching for funds, foundations, individuals, et cetera, these are people that care about our community. And I think that whether we may have a disagreement politically, I don't think those are the types of people that are aligned with some of the more harsher rhetoric that we hear.
Kamaria Swan, who's a proud TFA alum, wants to know, how did you transition from teaching to nonprofit management? And you had a number of transition jobs right in there, at least two that I know of.
Yeah. I think I just leaned on my network and.
But tell what are the jobs you were at? Commit?
After I taught for 4 years, my first job, non-teaching, was in corporate philanthropy, working as an advisor to the CEO of a company. And I found that job on the TFA alumni board. So I just applied for it. Yeah. And that was really my first step because through that position, I met the folks at Commit in Dallas.
And then through Commit, you met me, and you worked at Children at Risk.
That's right.
And,
So.
And every step of the way, people said, this young man is a superstar. I'm going to hire him right away. Because there's always a joke at Children at Risk. We were talking about it earlier today about how we have a long interview process and we take people to lunch, and you're still wondering where your lunch is. How come you never got taken to lunch?
Right.
I just hired you, that's why. So, let's see. Myra Rock wants to know, why do you think that Latino leadership is so low, Andy?
Well, I think that through this, one of the things I'm really enjoying about this role is I'm getting to meet a lot of outstanding Latino and Latina leaders outside of education, outside of my immediate circles and network. And there's a lot of outstanding Latino leadership out there, actually.
Yeah.
I just think a lot of times the dots aren't connected. There's a lot of great Latino leaders that maybe education did play a role in their life, but if you're someone that works in the private sector, you could devote your time to criminal justice, environmental justice, healthcare, education, animal rights, etc. And so they may be involved in another field, and that's why we may not see them as much. But I think that a lot of times there just isn't that support, there isn't that connecting the dots, and I think there's more of an opportunity to bring existing Latino leadership into the fold.
And I think there's a lot of Latino leadership in the business community, right? Yeah. Which is sort of the common thing. When you're a first-generation college student, usually business is something you see. You see teachers, you see business people, and so you'll go into some of these areas that are sort of common, right?
Yeah.
So.
But there is no doubt that we need more Latino leaders.
Yeah.
In the teaching force, nonprofit sector, all across the board.
Abby Johnson wants to know, at what point in your life, Andy, did you decide that you wanted to be working for a nonprofit? And what were the first steps that you took to making that happen? When was it that you sort of made that connection?
Yeah. Well, I think that I don't know if I decided right away this is what I want to do, but I think with each role that I've taken, I've decided this is exactly the type of work that I want to be doing right now. and that happens to be with a nonprofit organization. And so naturally, I've shaped my career, right, in the nonprofit sector. I will say that throughout Teach for America and after Teach for America, and when I was trying to decide what to do and whether or not to switch gears into a private sector, I did talk to a lot of my friends who were already lawyers or who worked in the business sector, and I got a lot of good advice from them and from my mentors to really think about what type of mark I want to leave and what type of work I enjoy doing, and to make sure that I wasn't just doing something for the sake of money, and to try to reach a balance between doing good work and also making a sustainable living.
And you don't choose to work in the nonprofit sector because of money, right?
Certainly not.
Star DeLuca wants to know, what traits and skills, when you're building a team, what traits and skills are you looking for?
Yeah. I think number one, people that are just passionate about the work. Because if you find someone that is passionate about the work, it's just not going to be an 8 to 5 job, right? And I think you're going to be less likely to want to micromanage that person. Not that you and I are micromanagers, Bob.
No, we're not.
Right, but but I think passion is really important. I think two is how does that person continuously learn and grow. So at Children at Risk, I was the director of the research center. I didn't have a degree in research or data science. When I worked in Dallas, I was so fascinated by data that I asked the research director there to teach me everything she knew about data. And that's where I learned how to analyze and visualize large data sets, which then positioned me to be able to lead the team at Children at Risk. And so what that reflects is just a curiosity for learning, which is so important.
Yeah. Peter Lee wants to know, what were the challenges or advantages for a nonprofit organization within the minority community in fundraising? Are there any advantages for Latinos for education, being a minority serving group?
I think that there's a lot of need, as you mentioned, for organizations to support the Latino community. So I think one advantage is that half of the population under age 18 is Latino. And so we need to develop the leadership capacity so that they're able to effectively contribute it to our society and to the education sector. People see the need in that. And so I think that is certainly an advantage. But something that we always have to think about is what's the return on investment, what we're trying to accomplish, especially now that funders are more data savvy and they want to know what are the outcomes.
How much money are you going to have to raise in your first year, Andy?
So we need to raise about $1.4 million for the next 2 years.
Wow.
Yeah.
And are you going to build a team as well?
That's right.
Yeah. How big will your staff be in 2 years?
Probably
You hope.
3 to 4 people.
Yeah. And how long will you work at a place like Latinos for Education?
Forever. Nice trick question, Bob.
But you must think about that, right? I mean, you want to give them a good long time where it's a natural transition. But where do you see yourself? 20 years from now, you have so much potential, Andy. You are a star. Where do you want to be? What are some of the thoughts? I mean, obviously you don't know.
Yeah.
But what are some of the thoughts that go through your mind?
Yeah, absolutely. I think in 20 years, in a long, long time from now, I would love to be the CEO of a larger organization that's creating impact across the entire region on a deeper systemic level. So I look at the leadership of CEOs here in the nonprofit world and just try to see what path they've taken. And so it's going to be really important for me, who's building an organization from the ground up, to be able to do it well, to be able to do it in a way that delivers results, so that then we can continue to move forward.
Yeah. Do you ever want to do political office, you think, Andy?
In the past I've thought about it.
Yeah. You seem to be like you'd be a natural, right?
That's what people say. But I think politics has always been challenging. But right now, it's pretty disappointing. So
It seems like it's even more challenging for not, right?
yeah, why would anyone want to do that?
Yeah.
So I don't know.
Yeah. Would you ever want to be like Secretary of Energy or Education or something like that? Not energy. That's that's Perry's job. So.
That would be that would be of course very interesting, and it's not as
As political.
right?
Yeah.
As running and doing all that. So.
All right.
If you know anyone that's hiring a secretary
of education. Yeah. Well, you never know when Betsy DeVos leaves. So Trump might need a Latino to. So Athena Moss Thomas wants to know what recommendations. This is interesting. What recommendations would you give to an executive director who is feeling ineffective in implementing the mission?
Wow.
Yeah.
I think the most important thing is to make sure that you have a few mentors to lean on. That there are people in your life with more experience than you, right? That you're able to, when you hit a block, able to ask some questions and get some advice. I wouldn't be where I am now without the support and the advice of mentors, especially as a first generation college graduate.
And people want to give advice, which is really interesting, right? You think, well, it's going to be hard to ask people for advice, but they want to help. People want to help, especially in the nonprofit world, but I think that's true across the spectrum.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, very good. Bobby Thomas wants to know, what's the most transferable skill that you have brought through each nonprofit that you've been involved with, Andy?
I think it's the curiosity to learn. Because every job that you're going to step into, there's going to be things that you're doing for the first time or that you haven't done before. And so you just have to be willing to learn and be able to manage through any disappointment and just kind of interpret it as this is just something that I need to learn and become better at.
Sarah D wants to know, in your career, Andy, how have you determined what opportunities to take when it comes to career choices?
Yeah. Well, I think the first thing, as in with a lot of different decisions in life, is to follow your gut. That's always been a very interesting thing for me. And I think the second thing is to have made sure that I was going to be in a position where I would be able to contribute to the organization in a meaningful way to help realize the impact that we're seeking to accomplish, but also that it was going to give me an opportunity to grow and do things that I hadn't done before, whether that was doing data analysis or managing a team or working with the media or teaching in a classroom, whatever that was, that there was something new I was going to be able to learn as well.
Yeah. Dr. Bob wants to know, when did you realize it was a mistake to leave children at risk and that you really should have stayed there?
About 5 seconds ago.
Oh, yeah. You will realize that, Andy Canales. So, Bobby Thomas, another question. He wants to, how would you define your leadership style, Andy?
Yeah. Well, I think to me, relationships are really important. I wouldn't be where I am now without relationships. And so my leadership style centers on building relationships with others, being sympathetic, having clear expectations, both for myself and for the people that I'm working with, especially the people that are working for me and my team. And then also making sure that I'm able to provide my team with the resources that they need to get the job done and for me to get out of their way.
Yeah. I've seen you struggle as a leader with decisions sometimes, right? Because you are very empathetic.
Yep.
Your staff loves you and you love your staff to love you, even though you make hard choices. But when you've had difficult staff, that becomes difficult for you in some ways, right? Talk a little bit about that for yourself.
Yeah. So I think, with every strength, there's a weakness.
Yeah.
And so,
but you learn to overcome it, right?
Yeah. I think part of the feedback I've received from friends and from coworkers and colleagues along the way is that while I'm very sympathetic and empathetic and I'm able to kind of build relationships and bring people together, sometimes, I can avoid like taking a hard stance or expressing a very clear opinion because I want to make sure that I'm building bridges. And so that's something that I've had to reflect on and try to work on. That I think there are times when you do need to take a stand, and there are times that you need to make a hard decision. And the more seniority you have, the more those opportunities will arise, and you just have to become comfortable with those things.
Yeah, yeah. It's tough. Sometimes these decisions are tough, though, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Let's see, one more question. Here's an interesting one. Mike Martin again. Have you ever experienced, because you're so young, and you are young, and you look young, have you ever experienced difficulty with leadership dealing with older people, and how did you deal with that?
Honestly, not really.
Yeah.
I just always try to position myself as someone who's competent.
Yeah.
And I try to express humility. And I think that's really important when I'm speaking with people who are older and who have done many of the things that maybe I'm trying to do as well. They've already done them. I try to learn from them. And I think when people see that, you know, a lot of times, not all the times, but a lot of times they want to help you out. So.
All right, let me try one more question here. Let's see. So Ruth Delaney wants to know, based on your experience, do you agree that higher education institutions should be required to use diversity within admissions?
Wow.
She's getting right down to it.
Yeah.
So.
I think that I think it's important to have a diverse population.
Yeah.
And I think no one would disagree that even poverty, right?
Right. That's diversity in some way, right?
Is really important.
Yeah.
I'll never forget when I was in college, I visited some of the states that I had never been to, Tennessee, Alabama, Georgia, that some of my good friends from the South had come from. And that was the first time for me that I came across low-income white people that in many ways faced many of those barriers that we talked about to college entry that I faced.
Yep.
And so I think that diversity on a lot of different fronts is really important to building a successful class and to making sure that the people in the program are learning from each other. So I just think that that's a component. Now, how do you exactly define that and measure that? I don't know. I feel like the law is always changing, and I think there's just a variety of ways to try to measure for that.
In some ways, an admissions office should try to put together a diverse class because that peer learning is so powerful that you want a group of first-year students working together to be learning from a lot of different people and a lot of different diverse backgrounds, right? I mean, in so many ways, including international students, right? This whole idea, it provides for a much more rich learning opportunity and environment for students. So it's a good question. All right, Andy, these are the tough questions now as we finish up today. So when they make the big, I understand this is going to be a blockbuster in Hollywood, the Andy Canales story, who's going to play you? Who's going to play Andy Canales in the big Hollywood movie?
Yeah. Well, I lived in Miami for 2 years, and during that time, became very fond of the music from Armando Christian Perez, also known as Pitbull.
Pitbull, yes. Yeah. So you want Pitbull to play you?
I hope I didn't mess up his name. But yeah, I think Pitbull would be great.
Yeah.
So
Pitbull would have to grow some hair.
I have to get a little wig, but I think he could make it work.
Yeah, very good. And your favorite restaurant in town, Andy?
So, you know, I like Gloria's. My friends give me a hard time because they say it's chain. But
it is a chain.
It's a Salvadoran Mexican restaurant.
I think all your favorite restaurants are chains, aren't they?
Yeah, it's a Salvadoran Mexican restaurant, and I think the pupusas at Gloria's are good. They're legitimate.
Are they as good as any you've had?
Yes,
Yeah,
I think they're
really?
great.
Yeah.
And so in arguments with friends, I will stand
with Gloria's.
With Gloria's, in spite of all the criticism that comes my way.
I thought you were going to
say.
But
a lot of people like Gloria's. It's not like I get a lot of
You
heavy
like Carne
criticism.
Rosso as well, don't you?
I like Carne Rosso as well because I used to live a few blocks down from the first Caneroso in Deep Ellum in Dallas.
In Dallas, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Talk about Dallas versus Houston. I mean, there's such a rivalry between, at least in Dallas, they always talk about Houston. Houston doesn't know that Dallas exists, but I wonder, what are the differences in the cities from your perspective?
Yeah, well, gosh, I feel like Dallas, just physically, is a lot easier to navigate, and it feels smaller and easier to navigate, and a little bit more put together. And I would imagine that it's probably because their zoning laws or the development laws might be different. And then Houston just feels a lot more spread out, a lot bigger. But I really appreciate Houston because as someone who grew up in Los Angeles, in another international city,
Yeah.
I feel right at home here because it's the most diverse city in the country. And I feel like people here are very welcoming. Half of
Yeah.
the population wasn't born here.
Yeah.
And so it's a very welcoming city, and I appreciate that about Houston.
Dallas loves when you're born in Dallas, don't they?
Yes.
And Houston could care, right?
Yeah,
It's
no.
like they don't, oh, you're from Houston, that's unusual.
Right.
But it's not a deal, is it?
Yeah.
It's sort of an
Yeah.
interesting, but Dallas is pretty.
Dallas is pretty.
Yeah.
Yeah. So they have that going for them. But I did see a bumper sticker in Austin once that said, life is too short to live in Dallas. So I'm sure they do the same for Houston.
I thought you were going to talk about the bumper sticker, keep Dallas pretentious.
Oh, yeah.
So, which is another great bumper sticker. Andy Canales, thank you so much for the work that you're doing. Thanks for being in the Nonprofit Leadership Studio. Yeah. That's it for our studio tonight. Keep up the great work, and we'll see you next time here at the Nonprofit Leadership Studio. Keep working.